The most beautiful face the ancient world left behind belongs to a woman nobody can fully identify. For more than a century, the painted bust of Nefertiti has stood as the very image of perfection, serene, flawless, ageless, the face that earned her the name, the Beauty of the Nile. The world looked at that surface and believed it understood her. It was looking at the wrong thing. In 2009, a medical scanner was aimed through the painted stucco, and what it found was not the queen everyone admired. It was a second face, carved in stone, deliberately buried beneath the first. The differences were small. Their meaning was not. What the scan exposed would reach past the bust itself, into 100 years of suspicion, accusation, and scandal that had gathered around her. The truth was never in the famous face. It sat 1 millimeter underneath it. Consider what the bust actually is before considering what it concealed. It is a sculpture roughly 19 inches tall, carved from limestone and wrapped in painted plaster, depicting a woman who lived more than 3,300 years ago. It was pulled from the sand of a ruined Egyptian city in 1912. Today it sits behind glass in Berlin, the single most valuable object in the finest collection of Egyptian art in Germany, and the reason most visitors come through the doors at all. People have called it the Mona Lisa of the North. They have called the woman it depicts the beauty of the Nile. The comparison to a painting is not idle. Like the Mona Lisa, the bust is famous less for who it shows than for how it shows her, a face so balanced and composed that it reads as timeless rather than ancient. Photographs of it traveled the world, and reproductions filled museum shops and school books everywhere. The image became a kind of shorthand for ancient Egypt itself, more instantly recognizable than the pharaohs who ruled the country. Here's the first strange thing about Nefertiti. We possess more images of her than of almost any other queen in Egyptian history, and we know less about her than about almost any of them. Her parents are unknown. Her birthplace is unconfirmed. The records that survive establish that she was the principal wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, and that she alone held the title Great Royal Wife. Beyond that, the woman dissolves into guesswork. Egyptologists who have spent careers on her concede the same uncomfortable point. She is the queen of whom we have the most pictures and the fewest facts. The reign she belonged to was one of the strangest in the entire pharaonic record. Her husband, Akhenaten, did something no Egyptian ruler before him had attempted. He set aside the old gods and elevated a single one, the sun disk called the Aten, reorganizing the religion of the most powerful state on earth around it. This is best understood not as a matter of belief to be judged, but as a historical event, a deliberate restructuring of worship and royal authority. He built temples open to the sky so the sun could fall directly on the offerings. He moved the court out of the established centers and founded a new capital in empty desert, a city raised quickly and abandoned almost as quickly. Within a generation of his death, his successors set about erasing him, dismantling his city brick by brick until the desert took it back. The bust of Nefertiti was made inside that brief, intense window and survived everything that came after it. That survival is the second strange thing, and it is the detail that would matter most. The bust emerged from the ground essentially whole. The colors were intact. The surface was smooth. The face was undamaged in a way that objects 3,000 years old almost never are. Experts who examined it remarked, again and again, on a state of preservation that seemed to defy the time involved. It looked, to more than one observer, too good. That impression would later harden into open suspicion, but in the beginning it was simply admiration. The face was perfect, and perfection is persuasive, and that is precisely where the trap was set. For a century, everyone who studied the bust, everyone who photographed it, everyone who stood in front of the glass was looking at the same thing, the painted outer surface, the serene cheeks, the level gaze, the unblemished line of the nose. That surface was treated as the queen herself, the final word on what Nefertiti looked like and how skilled the artist had been who captured her. Nobody had reason to ask what lay beneath it. The plaster was assumed to be skin over a plain stone support, a shell with nothing underneath worth seeing. The assumption was reasonable. It was also wrong. The one part of the bust nobody had examined was the one part that held the truth, and it would take a hospital scanner and a great deal of suspicion before anyone thought to look. The instrument that finally looked beneath the surface was not an archaeologist's tool. It was a medical one. In 2009, a team led by Alexander Huppertz, director of the Imaging Science Institute in Berlin, brought the bust to a hospital and ran it through a computed tomography scanner, the same kind of machine used to look inside a living patient. The findings were published that year in the journal Radiology, and they did something no chisel, no caliper, and no century of close looking had managed. They showed the inside of the most famous face in the ancient world without touching it. This was not the first attempt. The bust had been scanned once before, back in 1992. But the technology of that decade was coarse by the standards of what came later. The older machine produced cross-sections of the object only every 5 millimeters, slices too far apart to capture fine detail. Whatever subtlety existed beneath the surface fell into the gaps between the cuts and went unseen. The 1992 scan confirmed that the bust had a stone interior and left it at that. The interior was treated as structural, a core that held the shape, nothing more. There was no reason on the available evidence to think otherwise. The 2009 scan was a different order of looking. Huppertz and his colleagues used a 64-section spiral technique that sliced the bust at intervals well under a millimeter, fine enough to register features hidden 1 to 2 millimeters below the painted skin. At that resolution, the bust stopped being a single sculpture and resolved into layers. The team could see exactly how it had been built. A core of limestone sat at the center. Over that core lay stucco, a plaster coating applied in layers of varying thickness, very thin across the face and the ears, considerably thicker at the back of the elaborate crown. The painted surface everyone had admired for 100 years was the outermost skin of this layered construction, not the sculpture itself, but a covering over it. And then came the part nobody had anticipated. When the scan rendered the limestone core beneath the plaster, the core was not blank. It was not the rough, functional support that everyone had assumed it to be. It was a second face, carved directly into the stone, delicately worked and highly symmetric, a finished piece of sculpture in its own right, hidden entirely beneath the painted exterior. Huppertz described the prevailing expectation plainly. Until the scan was done, he explained, no one knew how deep the stucco went, or whether any face existed underneath it at all. The working assumption had been that the stone below was merely a mold, a blank to build on. Instead, the machine had found a skillfully rendered work of art where everyone expected dead weight. The bust, in other words, had 2 faces, one of stone, carved first and then covered, one of plaster, shaped over the top and painted, the version the world had been looking at all along. For 3,000 years, they had sat one against the other, separated by a layer thinner than a coat of paint, the hidden one preserved perfectly because the visible one sealed it away. The scanner had peeled them apart without laying a finger on the object, reading through the surface the way it would read through skin to find the bone beneath. That alone would have been a remarkable technical achievement, a clean demonstration of how far imaging had come since the older scan failed to find anything. But the discovery did not stop at the existence of a second face. The obvious question came immediately behind it. If a sculptor had taken the trouble to carve a complete and careful face in stone, and then a second hand had covered that face with plaster and reshaped it, the two could simply have matched, the outer skin following the inner carving line for line. They did not match. The 2 faces of Nefertiti were not the same face, And the differences between them, small as they were, are where the truth had been waiting. Set the two faces side by side as the scan allowed for the first time, and the differences are not random. They run in a single direction. The inner face, the one carved directly into the limestone, has creases at the corners of the mouth and across the cheeks. It has a slight bump on the ridge of the nose. The cheekbones sit lower and less pronounced. The corners of the eyelids are shallower, with less of the carved depth that gives an eye its drama. None of these are flaws in the carving. The stone face is finished, symmetric, and skillfully done. They are simply the marks of a real face, the small irregularities that any human face carries. Now look at the outer face, the plaster surface the world has admired for a century. The creases around the mouth are gone, smoothed away. The bump on the nose has been straightened into a clean line. The cheekbones have been raised and sharpened. The eyes have been given more depth at the corners. Every difference between the two faces moves the same way, from the particular toward the ideal, from a specific woman toward a flawless one. The plaster did not correct mistakes in the stone. It edited a face that was already complete. That direction is the whole point, and it is what Huppertz and his colleagues drew attention to. The adjustments were not accidental, settling of the material, or the drift of an unsteady hand. They were deliberate. Someone, looking at a finished and accurate carving of the queen, made a decision to soften it. The wrinkles were retouched out. The nose was eased. The result, the researchers suggested, reflected the aesthetic ideals of the era, the way a royal image was supposed to look rather than the way the woman herself happened to look. The plaster face is not a portrait. It is an improved portrait, shaped to a standard of perfection that the stone beneath it did not quite meet. This reframes the most looked-at face in the ancient world in a single stroke. The serene, unblemished surface that earned Nefertiti the name the Beauty of the Nile is not a faithful record of her features. It is a correction applied over them, a layer of idealization no thicker than a coat of paint, laid down more than 3,300 years ago and trusted ever since as the real thing. The perfection everyone admired was the achievement of the editing, not the woman. The famous face was, in the most literal sense, retouched. And the face underneath, the one nobody was meant to see, may be the closer likeness. The inner carving is delicate enough and accurate enough that it could be a genuine attempt to capture how the queen actually appeared, lines and asymmetric nose and all. There is no way to confirm that it was taken from life in any direct sense, and that claim should be held carefully rather than asserted. But the logic of the two layers points in one direction. The stone records a face, the plaster improves it. If either of the two is the real Nefertiti, it is the hidden one, the woman with the creased mouth and the slight bump on her nose, not the polished icon laid over the top of her. Consider what that means for the act itself. Someone in that workshop carved an honest face, and then someone, perhaps the same hand, perhaps a directive from above, decided the honest face was not what should be shown. The real woman was sealed in stone, and a better version was presented to the world. The decision worked completely. For 3,000 years, the correction was the only face anyone knew. The queen was admired for features that had been adjusted to suit a taste she had no part in setting. The scan did not make Nefertiti less beautiful. It made her real. Beneath the perfect surface was an actual human face, lined and particular and slightly imperfect, the kind of face that belongs to a person rather than a symbol. The plaster had hidden that for a very long time. It had also, as it turned out, helped keep the whole object intact, and the way the bust was built would matter for reasons that went well beyond its appearance. The same scan that exposed the hidden face also produced something less dramatic but just as valuable, a complete map of how the bust was put together, layer by layer, and where it was weak. The researchers were not only hunting for a second face, they were assessing the object's condition, and the picture that emerged explained things about the bust that had never been fully understood. The construction was not simple. At the center sat the limestone core, carved into the inner face. Over that core, the sculptor applied stucco, a plaster coating, but not in a single even shell. The scan showed the plaster laid down in layers of markedly different thickness depending on where it fell. Across the face and the ears, the stucco is very thin, barely more than a skin, which is why the features beneath sit so close to the surface, only a millimeter or two down. At the back of the tall crown, by contrast, the plaster is built up in two thick layers. The bust is not one material shaped once. It is a core and a series of coatings assembled in stages, each stage doing a different job. That layered build is elegant, but it is also fragile, and the scan made the fragility specific. Between the layers of stucco, the imaging revealed fissures, fine cracks running where one coating meets another. It also showed that the bonding between layers was not uniform. In places, the plaster gripped the core firmly. In other places, it held more loosely, the join imperfect. The most vulnerable zones were identifiable and consistent. Cracks at the shoulders, weakness along the lower surface of the bust, the thick, fissured stucco at the rear of the crown. These were not visible to a person standing in front of the glass. They were internal, hidden in the same way the second face was hidden, and the scanner found them the way it finds a hairline fracture in a bone. This turned the examination into a conservation document. The team came away able to say, with precision, where the bust must not be touched and what kind of handling would put it at risk. Pressure on the thick layers of plaster at the crown was to be avoided. The fissured areas needed careful support. A 3,000-year-old object that looks solid behind glass is, on the inside, a structure of mismatched layers held together across old cracks, and now there was a chart of exactly where those cracks ran. That finding landed on an argument that was already live. 2 years before the scan, in 2007, the director of the Berlin collection, Dietrich Wildung, had refused a request from Egypt to lend the bust for an exhibition, citing its fragility, its inability to safely make the journey. The request and the refusal were politically charged, bound up in a long dispute over where the bust belongs, and the fragility claim could easily have looked like a convenient excuse. The scan gave that claim physical evidence. Huppertz noted that the imaging supported the position that the bust was too delicate to travel. The cracks were real. The uneven bonding was real. Whatever one thought of the politics, the object genuinely could not be packed into a crate and shipped without risk. But there is a quieter implication in all of this, and it points forward. For nearly 100 years, the true internal nature of the bust had been unknown. People knew the painted surface intimately and the inside not at all. They did not know there was a second face. They did not know how the layers were stacked or where the object was weak. They did not, in a real sense, know what the thing was made of beneath its skin. An object admired that completely and understood that incompletely is an object about which almost anything can be alleged. And something had been alleged loudly and for decades by people who looked at that flawless, preserved surface and reached a very different conclusion from admiration. They looked at the same perfection and decided it was not ancient at all. The accusation came from a Swiss historian named Henri Stierlin, and he spent roughly 20 years building it. His conclusion was blunt. The bust of Nefertiti, he argued, was not a 3,000-year-old Egyptian masterpiece. It was a modern fake, a copy made in the early 20th century and passed off as ancient. The starting point of his suspicion was the very thing everyone else admired: the preservation. To Stierlin, the surface was too pristine, too crisp, too well kept for an object that had supposedly spent more than 3,000 years in the ground. In his phrase, it was too new to be true. A face that flawless, he felt, did not belong to the ancient world. It belonged to a workshop much closer to the present. He pointed to a second detail that genuinely is strange. Lying beside Nefertiti when the bust was found was a companion piece, a bust of her husband, the pharaoh Akhenaten, and that one was wrecked, its face broken apart. Two objects from the same place, the same moment, The same burial in the sand, in completely opposite states. One smashed, one immaculate. Stierlin asked why time would treat them so differently, and it is a fair question to ask. He raised a further anomaly in the carving itself. The shoulders of the Nefertiti bust are cut vertically, straight down, and that is unusual in Egyptian sculpture, where busts are typically cut horizontally across the shoulders. An odd cut, he suggested, was the mark of an artist who did not truly know the conventions he was imitating. His theory tied it together. The bust was an experiment, a piece made to study ancient color and sculpting technique that somehow came to be treated as the real thing. The case was serious enough to demand answers, and the answers, point by point, did not favor the forgery. Each was supplied by named specialists. The plaster covering the bust was chemically analyzed, and its composition matched the kind used in the Amarna period, the era the bust supposedly came from, a recipe a later forger would have had no way to reproduce because the technology to even identify it did not exist until the middle of the 20th century. The pigments told the same story. Analysis confirmed they were authentic ancient materials, prepared by techniques abandoned after that period. The German Egyptologist Rolf Krauss demonstrated that the bust was built to a precise proportional system based on the ancient Egyptian unit of measurement, the finger, with facial features falling on a calculated grid. A forger working in the early 20th century would have had to know and use an ancient measuring standard rather than a modern one, an unlikely feat. And the strange vertical shoulder cut turned out not to be unique at all. A second bust with shoulders cut the same way exists in the Berlin storerooms, also from the excavations, which removes the anomaly entirely. The scan fits on the side of authenticity as well. The object it revealed is not the crude product of someone faking ancient work. It is a carefully carved limestone face, finished and symmetric, then covered and idealized in a deliberate, multi-step process, exactly the kind of layered workshop method a genuine royal sculptor would have used. A forger building an experimental copy had no reason to carve a complete and accurate inner face and then bury it beneath the plaster where no one would ever see it. The hidden face is evidence of real craft, not imitation. The materials, then, are authentic. The construction is consistent with the period. The anomalies have answers. By the weight of the evidence, the bust is what it claims to be. And yet a single hard limit keeps the question from ever closing completely. No technique exists that can date carved stone directly. The plaster can be analyzed, the pigments can be tested, the proportions can be measured, but the age of the limestone itself cannot be read. So the bust holds its certainty just out of reach, authentic by every available measure, unprovable by the one measure that would settle it for good. The suspicion that surrounds it is not the only controversy. There is also the question of how it left Egypt at all. The bust came out of the ground on the 6th of December, 1912, during a dig led by the German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt in the ruins of Akhenaten's abandoned capital. It was found in the workshop of a sculptor named Thutmose, the personal artist of the royal couple, buried in a corner of the studio where it had sat for more than 3,000 years. By the standards of the time, it was the find of a lifetime, and Borchardt knew it. What happened next is the subject of an accusation as serious as the forgery charge, and unlike that one, this charge has found support among the people who run the museums themselves. At the start of the 20th century, the custom in Egypt was that objects pulled from a dig were divided between the excavators and the Egyptian state. In January of 1913, a Frenchman named Gustave Lefebvre was sent to oversee the partition of Borchardt's finds to decide what stayed in Egypt and what could leave for Berlin. The bust of Nefertiti left for Berlin. The question that has never gone away is how the single most beautiful object from the entire excavation ended up in the German share rather than the Egyptian one. The accusation, advanced over the years by the former Berlin curator Rolf Krauss and pressed hard by Egypt's antiquities chief Zahi Hawass, is that Borchardt concealed what he had. On the official partition list, the object was entered not as a painted limestone bust of a queen, but as a plaster bust of a princess, a far humbler description that understated both its material and its importance. The photograph shown to Lefebvre, by this account, was dim and partial, taken in poor light, framed so the full splendor of the piece did not register, and the bust itself was reportedly kept packed away rather than set out plainly for inspection. Lefebvre, an expert in ancient writing rather than sculpture, is said to have signed off without ever examining the object closely enough to see what it truly was. This is where the scan reaches into a controversy it was never designed to touch. Part of the alleged deception was a claim about the material. Borchardt is said to have described the bust as gypsum, a cheaper substance, rather than the limestone it actually is. The imaging settles the physical fact beyond dispute. The bust is a limestone core under layers of stucco. It is not a plaster object, and it is not gypsum. So the description that traveled with it through the partition, the one that helped it pass quietly into the German share, does not match what the bust is made of. The scan cannot prove anyone's intent, and intent is exactly the thing that remains contested. But it confirms that the object was misdescribed, and a misdescription that happens to make a masterpiece sound like a minor piece is difficult to read as innocent. From there, the dispute hardened into a standoff that continues today. Egypt has argued for the bust's return on the grounds that it was taken out of the country improperly, that the rules of the partition were subverted by concealment, and that an object so central to Egyptian identity belongs in Egypt. Germany has held that the division was conducted legally, that the Egyptian inspector had the opportunity to examine everything on the table, and that the bust passed fairly into German hands. The fragility revealed by the scan feeds quietly into this as well, since an object too cracked to travel cannot easily be sent anywhere regardless of who is judged to own it. The two positions have not moved. So the scanner that went looking for a hidden face ended up brushing against every controversy attached to this object at once. It exposed the idealized surface and the real face beneath it. It mapped the fragility that keeps the bust locked in Berlin. And it confirmed the limestone fact that sits at the center of the theft accusation. One examination reaching into questions of art, of preservation, and of ownership, all of which had been argued for decades on far less evidence than a single submillimeter scan could provide in an afternoon. The smooth golden face was always a mask of a different kind, not a forgery, but an idealization, a correction laid over the truth and trusted in its place for 3,000 years. The scanner did to the bust what the sculptor never intended. It looked underneath, and what it found was not a flaw and not a fake, but a real face the world had never been allowed to see, creased and particular and human. For a century, admiration was aimed at the surface, while the truth sat 1 millimeter beneath it, carved with care and then quietly covered. Nefertiti kept her secret in plain sight, behind the most looked-at face in all of history. The scan finally exposed it, and in doing so, it gave back something the perfect surface had taken away. It made her, at last, a person rather than a symbol.